Hey, my name is Sam, and here's my small talk on tiny games and why you should make them. Now, when I say tiny games, I'm referring to two kinds of tiny: tiny in size, as in low res and low memory, and also tiny in scope. And when I say bigger games, I'm talking ones with large scope, lots of levels, lots of hours of fun. But modern games have also gotten quite big in terms of file size and overhead. So, an extremely brief history. When video games started being a thing, they were very tiny by nature. They just simply could not be any bigger due to their hardware. So take the Atari 2600, released in North America in 1977. The Atari was limited to one mirrored background and just 5 movable sprites consisting of 8 pixel wide player sprites, 2 missile sprites, which are effectively just horizontal lines, and a single ball that can be scaled up a bit. So you can see how that could limit what sort of games could be made with this hardware. However, despite those limitations, developers still found clever ways of displaying more on the screen and allowing for more complex games on the Atari. Later, quite a bit later, in 1983, we got the Famicom, also known as the NES in North America. It's capable of displaying a bunch of multicolored sprites on the screen, as well as scrolling backgrounds made up of tiles, and just allows for a lot more complex games and visuals. So this allowed for big games like the first Super Mario Brothers or The Legend of Zelda. Later on in the 90s, we got a bit more limited with the advent of handheld devices like the Game Boy. And in some cases, they became beautifully tiny with devices like the Tamagotchi that had adorable little mini games along with the virtual pet. These days, with all these fancy graphics and this abundant computing power, games are bigger than ever, but some folk have decided that they like the limitations, so they created virtual hardware in the form of fantasy consoles. An example of a fantasy console is Pico 8. Pico 8 is a tiny game engine with only 16 colors and a 128 by 128 resolution. Pico 8 lets you program, draw sprites, design maps, and author music and sound effects, all within its own limitations. While fantasy consoles impose virtual restraints, there also are a couple of real hobbyist consoles with physical constraints, such as the Arduboy with its 128 by 64 resolution 1-bit screen running on an Arduino, and the Playdate with its non-backlit grayscale display. These devices let you load up any game developed by the community, and they are often very tiny and enjoyable experiences. So that's cool and all, but why make tiny games? First of all, because tiny games can be finished. Having a real limit on how big a game can be means that there's a hard stop on how much content can actually go into it. Another reason is that limitations require creativity. It's a good exercise to look at a set of limitations and go, what could I create that makes the most of these limitations? So, who am I to be telling you all this? Well, I am myself an enjoyer of creating tiny games. The first one here is a Pico 8 game created with an extra limitation of making it 1-bit style instead of the regular 16 color palette. And the biggest limitation here is the map size. You can only have so many screens for the platforming puzzles to take place in. This here is a collection of my own sort of virtual consoles. They're each a very arcadey style, cohesive game with as few sprites and art as possible. They each have 1-bit screen, which is 64 by 48 resolution. They've got 10 layers to stack things on top of each other, and they've only got 8 buttons to be able to use and play the game. I've also extended that out into a Unity game library that essentially takes the same sort of draw functions that I use for drawing the sprites to the screen, sets it to a fixed frame rate, and allows me to render that to a texture and slap it onto anything within Unity. So that also extends to more complex things like this inventory system here with all sorts of inventory slots and expanding panels. This would be a lot more complex if I wasn't able to just draw a sprite anywhere on the screen as I pleased. So there's a few technical things that help a lot when creating these tiny games. The first to take advantage of is a fixed time step over a variable time step. A variable time step, like what is present in Unity, is useful for designing for a wide range of hardware and generally used for 3D games, and it requires many aspects of your code to be scaled by a delta time variable. This comes at the cost of a lot of things breaking at lower frame rates or at very high frame rates, leading to some things being more complex than it should be. Tiny games generally don't have this issue since they come with such a little overhead that pretty much any computer can keep up with the fixed time step. It simplifies lots of movement and animation code. So take this example on the above here. It's a single line of code that you can give to anything with a position, give it a target position, and it'll simply smoothly move towards it and stop. So you can plop this code onto anything in the game and give it a bit of extra polish. In the example below, similarly, 2 lines of code gets a dampened spring motion, which can just add that extra bit of polish with barely anything else to it. Another thing that helps with the creation of tiny games is the use of pixel art. So pixel art is just very fast to create, it's easy to iterate on. Generally, it's the preferred method of most people that create small games like this, and that's usually down to how malleable it is. You can take one small sprite and create like much bigger, more complex visuals out of that. So here you can see that the road tiles are just simply these 3 lines repeated. The land at the top there is the single sprite there, and the water there is just a small animation of lines moving across. So thank you very much. Hopefully I've inspired you at least a little bit to start thinking about creating a tiny game of your own. Yippee!